So we're going to talk about the rise of Turkey. And this is something that's been going on for years, and it continues to grow. And it is only getting bigger. Turkey's geopolitical leverage, Turkey's military might, Turkey's geopolitical importance, Turkey's influence. And we're seeing Turkey saying, hey, we want Ukraine to be in NATO. We're seeing Ukraine saying, we're seeing Turkey talking with Europe about how they want to deepen each other's ties, how they want to deepen their security ties. Because the Europeans are saying we can't trust the Americans, we really can't rely on the Americans, so let's work closer with the Turks. So we're seeing the beginning stages of this Turco-Germanic axis, similar to what the world saw in World War I, when Turkey and Germany were allies against the British and the Russians. So history is rhyming. But in the midst of all this, we are seeing the rise of Turkey. And Turkey is really, really growing geopolitically. It's expanding its presence in Africa tremendously. It's expanding its presence in the Mediterranean, expanding its power, growing its power in the Middle East. So the rise of Turkey, very, very clear, very clear. And this is something that we've been talking about for many years now. My father warned people about this many, many, many years ago, decades ago, and most people didn't believe him at first. But now people see it. They say, oh, look, Turkey is rising. And now everyone's talking about the rise of Turkey. But my dad was really a pioneer in warning people about the revival of Turkish power. And he foresaw the coming of Turkish power, the revival of Turkish power, just by reading the Bible. It's quite amazing. So it says here, Erdogan tries to leverage Turkey's NATO muscle as U.S. retreats. And this is very, very interesting. Turkey wants closer cooperation with Europe in return for security as the continent looks at ways to reduce reliance on Trump's America. And this article came out yesterday, published by Bloomberg. Very, very interesting. So the Europeans are saying, we can't rely on the Americans. Let's deepen our ties with Turkey. Let's increase our military capacity. Let's invest more in our military industries. You have the Germans investing more in its military industry. You have Rheinmetall stock growing by leaps and bounds. You see Volkswagen going down, and you see Rheinmetall increasing tremendously. Rheinmetall is Germany's biggest defense company, and it's also Europe's biggest munitions company. And so you are seeing Germany gradually becoming more and more of a military economy, a war economy. It is very, very surreal because we are seeing really the rhyming of history. So it says here, when Recep Tayyip Erdogan addressed foreign ambassadors at an iftar dinner in Ankara to break the Ramadan fast last week, he was clear about what he wanted, a permanent seat for an Islamic country on the United Nations Security Council and European Union membership for Turkey. The demands are unlikely to be met anytime soon, if at all, but they reflect a renewed swagger for Erdogan as Turkey emerges as a more prominent power broker and NATO linchpin as the U.S. reconfigures its commitment to Europe. And it says here, the Turkish president has expanded the country's military and diplomatic footprint from Africa to the Middle East. And we'll talk more about Africa later. There was an interesting article published recently on Turkey's military presence in Africa and how it just continues to grow. Hell, Turkey, which is a major member of NATO, Turkey wants to build a giant rocket launching site in Africa. And I want to say Somalia. They want to just build a big old freaking rocket launching site, and they want to launch rockets into space from freaking Somalia. No one's talking about this. Very few people are reporting on this. Very few media outlets are reporting on this. But it really goes to show how much Turkey is growing. And so the Germans are saying we can't rely on the Americans for our security. They've been saying this for years. And for years, the Germans, even under Biden, supposedly, the big pro-NATO president, even under Biden, the Germans were talking about this, saying, listen, we really can't just keep continuously relying so much on the Americans. We have to become more and more militarily independent. So now we have this big major Mediterranean power, Turkey, that continues to grow. We see Germany growing as well, but not as much as what Turkey has grown to. But the Germans recognize the power of Turkey, and the Germans are saying, okay, let's work together. It's almost like they're bringing back the band. Let's bring the band back together. Let's go back to the glory days of the Kaiser and Otto von Bismarck making ties with the Ottomans. That's what this reminds me of. It just totally invokes images from history. World War I, the Ottoman Empire, and Germany were allies against the Russians. And so we see the Turks and the Europeans talking about what? Deepening security ties. Now he wants closer defense and economic cooperation with the EU in return for security as the continent looks at ways to reduce reliance on Washington. That could include Turkish troops joining a future Ukraine peacekeeping mission, according to people familiar with the matter. And Turkey is very interested in Ukraine. For one thing, if you look at a map, you'll see what? Let's look at a map, everyone. Why is Ukraine geopolitically so important to Turkey? Why is Ukraine so important for Turkey? Let's look at a map. Here's Ukraine. Here's Turkey. Russia over here. So Russia and Turkey are enemies. Ukraine and Russia are enemies. So they want to join forces with the Ukrainians to fight the Russians. Also, keep in mind who lives in Crimea. Here's Crimea, where Yalta is, Sevastopol, right? Crimea is inhabited by who? Turks. Crimean Turks, Tatars. And Erdogan says, oh, we're related. He did this years ago. He went out, he visited the Tatars of Crimea, and he said, we're related, guys, and we're going to work together. So the Turks want to use those Turkic peoples, or they're going to try to use, or they're going to at least, they want to use those Turkic people, this Turkic people, as a proxy against the Russians. And so they're right across the Black Sea. Turkey and Russia are in competition over who controls the Black Sea. So, of course, the Turks are going to be interested in what happens in Ukraine. This is geopolitically very obvious. So Turkey can get into Ukraine. They can ally together against the Russians. They can use the Turks in Crimea as proxies. That's if the Turks want to be used as a proxy. That's if the Tatars want to be used as a proxy. Turkey and Russia, historically, enemies. They don't like each other. They're competing over the Black Sea. Ukraine and Russia don't like each other. So what is Turkey going to do? Right? What does a powerful country do? What does a regional power do in such a situation? Well, you become allied with the enemy of your enemy. So work with the Ukrainians, and then Turkey could use this as an opportunity if Turkey is going to be allowed to do this, but Turkey could use this as an opportunity to put its troops in Ukraine, expand itself militarily, and go against the Russians in this way, in this manner. That could include Turkish troops joining a future Ukraine peacekeeping mission, according to people familiar with the matter. Independent policymaking under Erdogan is paying off as it showcases the value of a strategic NATO ally where the West is having trouble, said Hasan Yükselen, founder of the Fusion Force Strategy, etc., etc. Turkey had a critical role in containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This is very true. And it's emerging as a country that can help end conflicts and stabilize the region. Yeah, that's the reputation that Turkey wants to have. But at the same time, Turkey uses destabilization as a opportunity to expand its military presence. We've seen this in Syria. We're still seeing this in Syria. And Turkey is going to continue to expand militarily into Syria. The new rebel government of Syria under HTS has already pretty much agreed to allow Turkey, it's going to happen anyway, but they recently made an agreement with Turkey to allow the Turks to construct military bases, specifically air bases in Syria. But it says here, and this article makes an important point. It says Turkey had a critical role in containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So during the Cold War, that is when the United States armed the hell out of Turkey and made sure that Turkey would be the second most armed country in NATO. When did Turkey start becoming the second most armed country in NATO? Answer, during the Cold War. Why? Very obvious. Very obvious why. Because the United States wanted to use Turkey as a weapon against the Russians, against the Soviets. And Turkey is right next to Russia. They are smack. Let's look back at the map here. They are smack next to Russia. And Turkey geopolitically is in a very important position. It's right in between the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and also the Aegean Sea. So that means, as I've said many times, Turkey controls the accessway from the Black Sea into the Aegean, into the Mediterranean Sea. Russia wants that access. NATO wants to make sure that Turkey has control of that accessway so as to restrict the expansion of Russia and not allow the Russians to have free access into the Mediterranean. And if Russia has that free access into the Mediterranean, Russia could then roam very, very well. Russia could thrive in the Mediterranean as a naval power in the Mediterranean. So with that said, Turkey becomes geostrategically very pertinent for NATO, and that is why the United States does not want to lose Turkey as an ally. This is the reason why Turkey is so geostrategically important. So imagine if Russia had complete control over access from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. You would see a much, much bigger Russian presence in the Mediterranean. You would also see a massive presence of Russia on the Black Sea. And this is the reason why Russia almost took over Turkey during or before the Crimean War. Russia had a war with Turkey. In fact, Russia has had numerous wars with Turkey. But there was a war in which the Russians were very close to actually taking over Constantinople, which is known as Istanbul today. And the British and the French allied with the Turks, and they defeated the Russians, pushed the Russians out of Anatolia, and prevented the Russians from taking over Turkey. But why were the Russians interested in taking over Turkey in the first place? Well, the Russians would say, well, it's because we were there to protect Christians, and I'm not denying that. But there was also geostrategic value in this. Imagine if Russia controlled all of Turkey. It would have complete control over access from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. And that's huge. Mediterranean is one of the most important bodies of water on Earth, one of the most important maritime territories in the world. The Americans want to make sure that Russia stays weak, and therefore, that is why it wants Turkey to be an ally of the United States, to use the Turks against the Russians. It's not very complicated. It really isn't. All these little proxy wars, all these proxy wars are quite pertinent, but they're not very difficult to understand. When Turkey cuts off the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, will Iran come to the aid of Russia? Will Iran go ahead? I have no idea. You know, I mean, like, these sorts of things are difficult to predict because the Iranians, at the end of the day, are Muslim and they're Shiites, and they hate the Israelis just as much as the Turks do. So I think that the Iranians and the Turks are going to be allies against the Israelis. I mean, they both hate Israel. They both want to destroy Israel. And uniting together against Israel would be a perfect opportunity and a perfect window of opportunity to really strike the Israelis. And the Iranians and the Turks having an alliance, you would have a Turkic-Persian alliance, and it would be double the power. It would be insanely dangerous to the Israelis. I think eventually the Russians are going to save Israel. And why do I say that? Well, if you look at World War II, the Russians liberated a lot of those death camps, and the Russians saved the Jews during World War II. The Russians, the Soviets, saved the Jews, and I think the same thing is going to happen. As I've said many times, history does not repeat exactly, but it sure as hell rhymes. And so I think Israel is just going to become a giant death camp. That's what I believe. I think Israel is going to become one giant Auschwitz. And I don't say that happily. YouTube, don't cancel this live stream, all right? I'm just giving the warning. I'm not saying this is great. I'm just giving the warning. But I think Israel will become a giant concentration camp and a giant death camp. And that's in the Bible. And if you don't believe in the Bible, you can look at things through the historical lens. You could look at things through the geopolitical plus the historical lens. But it's also in the Bible, the destruction of Israel. And so I think that the Russians will save the Jews just as the Russians saved them from the death camps of the European far right. And yes, I will call them far right. The Nazis were far right. Many years ago, I said that the Nazis were liberal, and there is truth to that. There's definitely overlap ideologically between the Nazis and the leftists, but there was also a lot of overlap between the Nazis and the far right, and ultranationalism mixed with Darwinism, and you got yourself a nice example of a very dangerous and very murderous and destructive far right ideological system. I'm finally early, having espresso. Good on you, my friend. I'm happy to have you on. Enjoy the coffee. We also gave them an autonomy in the Far East, though. Oh, yes, that's correct. Yeah, there's the Jewish province of the Russian Federation. Very fascinating, actually. Let's see here. The Cuban Missile Crisis was because of Turkey. That's right. Here's an answer for you. Map of the Ottoman Empire. What do you notice, guys? What do you notice? Look at Ukraine. Big ol' fat chunk of Ukraine is under Ottoman control. Look at that. Crimea, all under the Ottomans. So the Turks want to bring back their empire. That's why they want to put troops in Ukraine. They want to retake what they believe belongs to them. Russia will be pissed when the Turkic Union is formed. All Russia's post-USSR lands will abandon Russia. So I think that the Turks are going to try to create a Turkic Union. They already have a Turkic Union, but it's not really super powerful at all. But there is on paper a Turkic Union. It's Turkey, some Central Asian countries, and then Hungary is the secretarial nation of the Turkic Union, which is hilarious. But it really makes you think more about Hungary. Like, can we trust Hungary? You have a lot of people in the United States, like, you know, the whole Tucker Carlson type people, who will sit there and say, "Oh, look, Hungary, they're so based Hungary, Hungary's so awesome. Look, they're refusing to help Ukraine." Yes, that's true. Hungary is refusing to help Ukraine, but I think Hungary, and I could be wrong about this, but I think Hungary has its own interest. I mean, when countries make decisions, you have to understand that countries, for the most part, are very Machiavellian, and they don't do things for the sake of doing good. They will do good only if doing that good serves a particular interest. So, back in the 1800s, Russia said, "Hey, Turkey, stop persecuting Christians in your empire." And Turkey didn't stop, even though Turkey agreed to do reforms, to enact reforms bettering the lives of its Christian subjects. Turkey didn't stop, and then there was a war. You could say, well, did Russia really care about protecting Christians? I think so. But at the same time, there was a geopolitical end. There was a geopolitical mission, and that was to crush Turkey. That was the reason. Because by crushing Turkey, you have power over the access way from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, which is extremely important for the Russians. You can look to, for example, the Serbian War of Independence, which is really, really fascinating. For 500 years, Serbia was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. 500 years, half a millennium. Imagine that. Under Ottoman control. And the Serbs fought for their independence. And eventually what happened was the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, which ended in 1878. So it was just a year-long conflict. But that year-long conflict proved to be the most significant war for the independence of Serbia, because the Turks defeated weird how my brain glitches like that. The Russians defeated the Serbs, and then there was the Congress of Berlin. And in the Congress of Berlin, Russia was the winner, so Russia called the shots. And Russia said, "Hey, Serbian independent state." And the Serbs got their independence. Now, did the Russians really care about the lives of Serbs? I'm sure there were Russians who definitely cared about Serbs, right? Like, we're human beings, and at the end of the day, human beings, regardless of our interests, we also have emotions, we also have compassion, and we do care about people, right? The great majority of us do. There are psychopaths out there who don't give a shit about anyone, but the overwhelming majority of human beings care about other people from some extent to another. And so I'm sure there were Russians, who really did care about Serbs. But at the same time, there was a geostrategic goal in carving out Serbia and making it into an independent country. And that goal was to reduce the size of the Ottoman Empire and thus weaken Russia's big enemy in the Mediterranean. So there's always geostrategic reasons. And so why is Hungary interested in not helping Ukraine? Why? Why is Hungary all of a sudden this pro-Russian country? Well, from what I understand, and take this with a grain of salt. I could be completely wrong about this, but I read this article, right? So there's different types of media. I know I'm kind of going off and segueing here, but it all connects, trust me. There are different types of media. You have American media, and you have British media. And British media and American media are almost the same. I mean, they overlap tremendously. But then you have Russian media, and then you have Turkish media, and you have Italian media, and you have German media. And all these different countries, all these different cultures, they have their own vibe. They really do. Like, I've spent many years doing this, and I will spend hours looking at English-speaking media, and then after exhausting myself looking at English-speaking media, I'll say, I wonder what the Germans are saying. So you go to Google Translate, and then you search the very words that you use to search the English media, but you just search it in the German equivalent. So, for example, if I'm searching German military rearmament in English, I'll look through the New York Times, Washington Post, DW, etc., and then I'll look up those very words in the German language, put it through Google, and I'll find a whole bunch of articles that overlap with what the Americans are saying, or with what the British are saying. But then I'll find articles that say different things, or they may give me more information, or they may give me different opinions, right? Different interpretations of the news. Same thing with Turkish media. If I'm looking up, let's say, Turkish news in the English language, you're going to get Haaretz, you're going to get New York Times, you're going to get Washington Post, you're going to get Politico, you're going to get the big mainstream news outlets. But then you look it up in the Turkish language, and you get different perspectives. You have Turkish people talking about the revival of the Ottoman Empire, Neo-Ottomanism. You have Turks talking about taking control of, taking back what belongs to Turkey and all this stuff. Same thing with the Greek media, right? You look up Greece in the news, and you'll get the typical stuff, right? Greece is buying more American weaponry. Greece is buying more American fighter jets. Greece is really worried about Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. But then you look up Greek media, and you'll get a whole bunch of other stuff. Right, they'll talk about Russia is right, or Turkey is rising up, Turkey is a threat, this is really serious for Greece, this is really big, really problematic for Greece, different interpretations of the media. And years ago, about 3 years ago, I looked into Polish media. This is when I started, I would say around the year 2018 or so, I started looking, 2019, let's just put it that way, 2019, I started looking into Polish media. Maybe 2020. All right, I'm being autistic about it. But years ago, I started looking into Polish media. And Polish media is different from the rest of the medias because it's very unique. It's looking at the news with a Polish perspective. And the Polish perspective is what? Critical of Russia. But the Polish perspective is also unique in the sense that it is critical of Russia, but it's also super critical of Ukraine. This is why I find Polish media really interesting to look at. And for fun, I do this for fun sometimes. I'm not joking. I'll do this for fun. Sit there with a nice cup of hot tea in the evening, and I'm going to look at Polish media. It's really fun because they just have such a unique perspective. You look at NATO-dominated media, and it's Russia bad, Russia bad, Russia bad, Ukraine's the victim, Russia bad. Right? That's really the British Anglosphere media. And then you look at Polish media, and Polish media is also Russia bad, but it's also Ukraine bad. So it's like, where do we go? Where do we go? Do we side with NATO? Do we side with Ukraine? And so that's why you see Poland spending so much money on its military, because Poland wants to become this big military power in Europe so that it could face the Russians, so that it could face other people as well. And there was an article that came out years ago. It was published by some Polish outlet. And it talked about why Hungary is glazing Russia so much. Why? Why is Viktor Orban just acting like he's so pro-Russia? And this article quoted this Polish lawyer. I forgot this Polish guy's name, but very controversial figure in Poland. Polish lawyer, been sued 1 million times, this guy. And I don't think he ever lost a single lawsuit, which is interesting. Polish guy, Polish lawyer, and he talked about, in this article, he talked about why the Hungarians are so interested in pleasing the Russians. And what the article said was that Hungary has a territorial claim to a chunk of Ukraine, Transcarpathia. So the Hungarians are interested in this part of Ukraine called Transcarpathia, and they claim that Transcarpathia used to belong to them. And so the Hungarians are thinking, well, maybe we can get a chunk. And so what this Polish lawyer said was Hungary's goal has absolutely shit all to do with being nice to the Russians. And it has everything to do with retaking Transcarpathia. And what this article explained was that the Hungarian plan is glaze Russia long enough with the hopes that if Russia fully takes over Ukraine, that Hungary can go to the Russians and say, hey, Russia, we glazed you for years. Can we get a chunk of that? We want Transcarpathia. And maybe you can do to us, or maybe you can do for us what you did for the Serbs back in the 1870s. You gave the Serbs their independent state. You gave them that territory that belongs to them. Transcarpathia belongs to us. And this is what this Polish guy said, that Hungary only gives a damn about retaking Transcarpathia from the Ukrainians. That's what the Hungarian goal is. And you know what? I believe it. Because the more you read history, the more you realize this. Countries are very, very Machiavellian. Yes, they will say, oh, we support this and we love this cause. And they will have this moral cause that they are for. And sometimes they genuinely believe in that cause while still having a geopolitical goal. And at times, probably most of the time, they don't give a shit about that cause and they're just using it as a pretext for a geopolitical goal. Regardless, at the end of the day, it's all just about a geopolitical goal. At the end of the day, it's about a geopolitical goal. It's not entirely about it, but there's always a goal. And the Hungarians have a goal. Countries don't do things from the goodness of their heart. So what's the Hungarian goal? I think that Polish article that I read many years ago, not many, but that I read several years ago, had a point that the Hungarians have a territorial claim to a chunk of Ukraine, the Transcarpathia, and they want it. And who knows, maybe the Hungarians are thinking, hey, Russia, maybe we can do a little deal. We can put some Hungarian troops over there in that area over there. And you know who else has a geopolitical goal in all this? Poland does. 100%. And listen, I used to have a lot of Polish people who used to watch my channel. I pissed off so many Polish people. Oh my gosh. Yeah, you can't imagine. I had all these Polish people watching my videos. They thought, oh wow, this nice Middle Eastern guy in America is interested in our country. And I am interested in Poland. Sincerely, I am. I'm very interested in Poland. Out of all the medias that I look at, I always find the Polish media to be the most entertaining. It's always the most fascinating. That and Israeli media. But I remember years ago I did a video about this and I pissed off a lot of people and there were a whole bunch of Polish people who were mad at me. But I think Poland has a geopolitical interest in all this because, hey, what happened after World War I? A whole bunch of Ukraine was given over to the Poles. And I'm not here to say which one is the correct inheritor of that land. That's not what I'm here to do, but I'm just recounting the history. After World War I, Poland got a whole bunch of territory. Now, what happened? Poland fought 3 wars after World War I. It's pretty crazy. I got to give it to the Poles. Very, very, very impressive. Poland had a war with the Ukrainians. Poland had a war with, who else was it? I think it was the Lithuanians. And let me look it up real quick. Hold on. Polish-Lithuanian war. Oh, I gotta fact check myself real quick. I'm pretty certain that they had a war with Lithuania. Yeah. Yep, I was right. Yep. So they had a war with Ukraine. They had a war with Lithuania. And I'm pretty certain they had a war with the Soviets. And the Poles, I think, won all 3 of them. And they took from the Lithuanians the Vilnius and the Suwałki regions. And they took from the Ukrainians a whole bunch of territory. I think it was Lvov, or it was a big chunk of territory. And what that ended up as was a giant... It was a ginormous bundle of tension between the Ukrainians and the Poles. And the Germans came over, they backed the Ukrainians against the Poles, and then the Germans gave them a bunch of guns, and the Ukrainians butchered 100,000 Polish people, at least 100,000 Polish people, really horrific stuff. And I'm talking about the Volyn massacres that happened in the region of Volyn and East Galicia and Lvov, and there was a lot of bloodshed that was going on. But there used to be a big city in Poland called Lvov. And Lvov is not in Poland anymore. And Lvov, if you talk to a Polish person, they will tell you Lvov is the center of Polish cultural history. And it was a big center of Polish culture. And now it's under Ukraine. Why is it under Ukraine? After World War II. There's a lot of borders were changed after World War II. And so Lvov was given over to the Poles. Lvov was given over to Ukraine. And so Poland thinks Poland is right when it says Lvov is Poland. So Poland has an interest in this. And remember what happened not too long ago. Poland said, hey, Zelensky, how about we put some troops into Ukraine? How about we put troops in Western Ukraine to help you guys out? And Zelensky said, no, we're not interested. Why did Zelensky say no? I think it's because Zelensky knows you Poles have a territorial claim to a chunk of Western Ukraine. So I think the Hungarians have an interest. I think the Poles definitely have an interest. When it comes to these conflicts, be it Palestinian versus Israeli, be it Slav versus Slav, Russia versus Ukraine, doesn't matter what happens. 30-day ceasefire, peace deal, ceasefire, there's going to be an Armistice, however you say the word, there will be blood. And this shit's going to resume. So I don't really focus too much on ceasefire deals. I mean, I do focus on them, don't get me wrong, because things can happen during a ceasefire and all sorts of geopolitical happenings can occur during a ceasefire, don't get me wrong. But that's my thoughts. So if they have a successful 30-day ceasefire, that's great. And I hope they do have peace. But there will be blood. There will be blood. That's my opinion on that. Poland is now Ukraine with the amount of Yuki refugees there. Well, there's about 3 million or so Ukrainians living in Poland, and some of them are Nazis. That's just, I mean, you can see it if you look into it. Some of them are explicit Ukrainian neo-Nazis, and they hate Polish people. But yet they're living there, and there's an area of Poland, there's a city in Poland, I think it's called Przemyśl, and the Ukrainians have a territorial claim on that city, and they want it back. The Ukrainian hard right nationalists, that is.